Good evening and welcome everybody to Monday Night Live countdown show from Courtroom Confidential, the fastest growing true crime news channel on YouTube. Thank you all so much for joining us. I am ready for a very good show. I asked Kaylin, are you juiced? Kaylin says she's juiced, mainly because I asked her, what's the weather like? And she said it had warmed up to a balmy 40 degrees in Minnesota. So that's fantastic. I told her if it was 40 degrees here in Los Angeles, we would all be huddled around a fire like cavemen, hoping that we would survive the harsh winter. But I remember from my time living in Chicago, when you would come out of a few weeks of really bitter cold and it would hit 40 degrees, you felt like it was t-shirt weather. So she's very happy. Thank you, everybody who's joining us already in the chat. I see a lot of familiar names, Pammy and K9 Catherine and Alicia K. Mayo. Thank you, guys. Afton, so much for being here. Tonight, we got some fun stuff to talk about. A lot going on this week. Some big developments took place last week. And then, of course, at the top of the hour, the whole reason why we're doing this show is just kind of as a warm-up countdown before we have our live premiere, which is our conversation series with Matt Murphy. Matt's a great guy. Matt's a fascinating guy. Matt has had a tremendous career as a prosecutor. He was an Orange County homicide prosecutor. In Orange County, they are a large yet smaller office of district attorneys. And so there was only about less than a dozen people who handled all of the homicides in Orange County. And he was one of them. And he was there for the longest period of time in history in Orange County prosecuting homicides. And he never lost one of them. And now he has left the office and turned his career towards legal commentating. And he's on 2020 and he's writing books. And he wrote the book of Murder, a Prosecutor's Journey Through Love and Death, which I read. And I will tell you this, and I told him this. So I've said it to his face, so I'll say it to you. At first, I thought, Matt, you're a wonderful attorney, but can you actually write? Because there's a big difference in those skill sets. There he is, handsome looking dude. There's a big difference in those skill sets. And, you know, just because you feel like you've got stories that make up a book doesn't necessarily mean you could write a book. He wrote the hell out of a book. And I even teased him about it. I'm like, did you actually write this thing? And he actually did write it. And it's a very fascinating, easy read. And you guys will absolutely love it. Jody says that she recently bought his book. I think you're going to really enjoy it. If you like true crime and if you like people digging into cases that are fascinating and talking about the murders and then how they proved it at trial, this is right up your alley. I highly recommend it. I don't get a dime from it, so I'm just promoting it to promote it. But it is well worth it if you guys are interested in that kind of stuff at all. Okay, so what that means is don't go anywhere, because at the top of the hour, we are just going through the magic of YouTube, transport you over to that live premiere, and we will be with you in the chat as we sit down to watch that interview that we did earlier this week. And it's, of course, got Kaylin's magic little sprinklings of footage that she's been able to find. But first, there were some huge developments in the Menendez case that took place on Friday. A lot of people scrambled around to cover this. I want to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the cases, ongoing trials that are still in court, cases that are having big hearings coming up this week. And as always, please stay to the end because we have announcements for you guys about what's coming up for Courtroom Confidential. If you haven't already, please like this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already. But let's jump into the Menendez case. So this is just a quick catch up as to what's happening with this thing, because I get asked this question all the time. Do you think these guys are actually getting out? If you had asked me that on Thursday of last week, I would have said yes. You ask me that now, and I don't think so. Not so much. They have three avenues in which to possibly get out. The first is they filed what's called a habeas petition, which is, think about it as like a Hail Mary in the legal appeals world. You have to have exhausted all of your other appeals, meaning you've tried to appeal, everything has not worked. You are at the end of your rope. You've got nothing less. and you can file a habeas, but you still have to have a reason to file it. So in their habeas petition, their reason was that they had this quote unquote new evidence in the form of a letter that was apparently from Erik to one of his cousins talking about this abuse. And they felt that if that evidence had been admissible at trial, it may have turned the outcome of the trial. So the press conference that was had by Nathan Hochman, the new DA in Los Angeles, on Friday, there he is, was just about this and the DA's position on the habeas petition, because the DA's office had never responded to it. And spoiler alert, he says that he's actually going to oppose it, because what it would have given the brothers is another trial. That's what they were asking for. Their relief was, give us a new trial based upon this new evidence. We will break down his reasons for denying that. The second avenue that they have is clemency. They've always had clemency. The Governor Newsom, could at any point decide that he's going to grant these two men clemency if he felt like it. Now, the only reason we're talking about that, though, is because the previous DA, George Gascon, had actually written a letter on top of filing a motion to resentence them, asking the governor, why don't you go ahead and grant clemency? In my view, that was kind of like, they're all passing around the hot potato of who wants to handle this issue. So he kind of dumped it in the governor's lap and said, hey, why don't you grant them clemency? The governor has decided to take a little bit of a backseat to all of that and said, well, I want to see what the new DA, Nathan Hochman, has to say about the Menendez brothers before I jump in. Here's the thing, though, about Gavin Newsom. The guy's a politician, okay? And he's going to do whatever he feels like is politically advantageous for him. He also, I think, no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention, wants to run for president. I think he's waiting 4 years to run for president. And I don't think, you're absolutely right, Farm Girl, everybody's trying to pass the buck. I don't think he wants to run for president as the guy who let two gentlemen who shotgunned their parents to death out of prison, okay? So I think clemency, likely not an avenue. And then finally, the third thing that they have the best shot at, which is a motion to re-sentence them. And this was filed by George Gascon. He said, I want them resentenced so that they were currently in life without parole. I want them sentenced to life with the possibility of parole, which means they would immediately become eligible for parole, and it would then be up to the parole board. Again, a little bit of a splitting the baby and passing the buck, but it was an interesting choice by Gascon because it gave them this light at the end of the tunnel kind of a moment. And that is the one that everybody is really waiting to hear about. That's coming up in March. So why have this press conference on Friday? Why did Nathan Hochman have a press conference that was nearly 50 minutes long to talk about why he is denying or why he is opposing their habeas petition? And he walked through everything. He talked about how this isn't really new evidence. This evidence was probably available to them before the trial. And if it wasn't available to them before the trial, they've had it for a long period of time before they filed this habeas. And if you don't believe any of that, well, then we actually have problems with the letter itself. We can't authenticate it. We don't know when it was actually written. We don't know who actually wrote it. All of these other things, all legal reasons, but he really spelled out why they're denying the habeas. But in the midst of all of that, he took an opportunity to talk about the case quite a bit. Not about how they've been in prison, not about how they're model prisoners, not about how they've started all these foundations and done all this wonderful work, and we should view their case differently now 30 years later. But he talked a lot about the murders and the circumstances surrounding it itself. And I wanted to play a little bit of that for you tonight, because I think this was probably the most important part in his press conference. And this is probably going to give you the best insight as to what they plan to do about that motion to resentence, which is really, if you care, their best shot of getting out at all. Okay. So again, this thing was long. I'm not going to torture you guys with the whole thing, but I'm going to share with you just this one portion that I think you guys will find interesting.
But the notion that this letter could be part of a continuum of lies and deceit and fabricating stories required us to go back into the history of the Menendez case to analyze whether or not that would be true. And when we analyzed that, what we found out is that Erik and Lyle Menendez had told 5 different versions of the events of what had happened. The first version that they told is that they did not kill their parents. This was the version they told during when they were first confronted, or they first made their 911 call. And they said that someone had murdered their parents, obviously not them. When they confronted the police, and the police showed up that night, they ran out screaming and crying that their parents had been murdered. They'd come home and found them that way. They didn't admit it themselves. That they went ahead, and in that version, again, they said it was a mafia hit. And they had the police investigate whether or not Jose Menendez had been killed by the mafia. That was the first version. The second version was that their father was a violent sexual predator who raped Lyle's girlfriend. This was a version that was shown when Lyle's girlfriend came forward and said that Lyle had confronted her and said that he wanted her to testify that his dad had violently raped her and that he wanted her to testify to that at trial. She refused to do so. The third version that Lyle told was that their father had molested Erik, but the mother had molested Lyle, without any mention of Lyle being molested by his father. Again, that version ultimately didn't show up at trial in their defense. The fourth version is that Erik and Lyle were both molested by their father. And the fifth version is that both their father and their mother were going to kill them the night of August 20th, 1989, which is why they shot them first. And I want to focus on the difference in many respects between the fourth and the fifth versions. Because again, the key for the trial is basically what happened that night, what was in their head that night. Sexual abuse is abhorrent, and we will prosecute sexual abuse in any form it comes. But sexual abuse in this situation, while it may have been a motivation for Erik and Lyle to do what they did, does not constitute self-defense. And that's why Leslie Abrahamson said back in 1993 that sexual abuse does not justify killing your parents, and that they would never argue that.
Okay, so that right there, I mean, it's probably the part that you need to hear more than anything else. Sexual abuse is abhorrent, and we will prosecute it to the fullest extent of the law. ... But it is not an excuse for killing your parents. But it does not qualify for self-defense. But it does not, it may have been the motive for what they did, but it does not excuse what they did. Again, we're talking about a habeas petition here, right? He could have gotten up and said, hey, we're going to oppose the habeas petition. We don't believe that the evidence can be authenticated. We don't believe that it was timely enough, and we don't believe that it was something that was unavailable to them at the time of trial. But he's going back to call them lying liars who lie and saying, even if true that all of this was taking place, the horrible things that they testified to, it doesn't excuse what they did. Think to yourself, why is he saying this at this press conference for a hearing that's going to come up in a couple of weeks?
So what happens in this continuum as we analyze some of the examples of the lies and the differing stories that have been told is that we actually saw stuff that was lied about before the killings, at the time of the killings, and in the months and years afterwards. And this evidence ranges from everything, including days before the killings. The Menendezes didn't go ahead and get their shotguns in Los Angeles and use their real names. They drove down to San Diego and used a fake ID and a fake address of one of Lyle's friends. Hours before the murders happened, they came up with a pre-planned alibi, where they had actually gone ahead and contacted one of their friends to say that they were going to go to Batman the movie that night, and they would meet the friend afterwards at the Taste of LA event. During the murders, the way that the murders actually happened was instructive to understand the deceit and the planning that went into it. There was over 12 shotgun blasts that occurred that night. One of the shotgun blasts was to Jose Menendez through the back of his head. After he was dead, there were shotgun blasts to each one of his knees. The shotgun blast to the mom initially didn't kill her. She actually ended up lying on the ground, groaning and bleeding in pain. And that's at the point where Lyle and Erik Menendez had run out of ammunition, reload, and Lyle puts the reloaded shotgun up to his mother's face and pulls the trigger, thus staging it at the time like a gangland hit.
Again, do we need all of this information for what this press conference was apparently about? Not really, right? 12 shotgun blasts? That sounds horrific. One of them to the back of their father's head, as in an ambush. 2 to his knees when he's already dead. 1 to their mother's face as she's begging for her life. What does this sound like to you? Does this sound like a press conference regarding the DA's position on a habeas petition, or does it sound like a closing argument? I mean, to me, and he's doing an excellent job of reciting the facts here and telling them in a way that is easy to understand and get an emotional response out of you. This is his closing argument on this case, and I think he's trying to remind the public of what is actually going on with this case.
Which then becomes their deceit and lie in the ensuing months that occurred. Then you had the deception that occurred where they hid the evidence of their crime. They had the wherewithal that night before they left the house to pick up each one of the shotgun shells that had been expended. They then had the shotgun shells with them. They had the bloody clothing and the shotguns. And they proceeded to go to Mulholland Drive to dump the shotguns and to a car wash's dumpster to drop off the shotgun shells and their bloody clothing. Then they decided to execute the pre-planned alibi. Again, the deliberate, premeditated state at this point, where they went ahead and they actually went to the movie theater to get the tickets for Batman the movie. Turns out that they couldn't get the 8 o'clock tickets because it was already past 10 o'clock. Then they called their friend to meet him at the Taste of LA, but by the point they got there, he'd already moved on. Then they actually called a friend to meet him again in another restaurant, and they never show up. Eventually, that friend comes to the house later that night, only to see police tape around the house. Now, after they were arrested, the Menendezes also tried to suborn perjury in a number of different respects. They contacted one of Lyle's girlfriends, Tracy Baker, gave her an actual script, a script that was actually found by the police, where it said that they wanted her to testify that Lyle's mother, Kitty Menendez, had poisoned them, had poisoned the whole family. She actually did testify to this extent in the first trial, but didn't testify to this in the second trial. They also contacted one of Erik's friends, Brian Eslamania, and asked him to falsely testify that Erik and Lyle Menendez were so fearful of their parents the weeks before the murders that they tried to borrow a handgun from Eslamania. He wouldn't testify to this. They also, again, as I mentioned before, asked a different girlfriend of Lyle if she would testify that Jose Menendez had violently raped her, and she wouldn't do that either. Finally, when it dealt with the handguns themselves, the Menendezes both testified that they had gone to the Big Five Sporting Goods in Santa Monica to actually buy handguns before they switched to the shotguns. But it turns out that Big Five Sporting Goods in Santa Monica in 1989 didn't sell handguns. So we looked at, again, the credibility of the letters, and particularly this
Okay, I'm going to stop it there because then he tries to tie it all in back to the habeas, and this was kind of like his long-winded explanation to explain why he doesn't feel that the letter itself is trustworthy. But he didn't need to add all of this. I mean, he didn't need to fill this entire press conference up with all of that. I had the real pleasure of being this was on ABC7, what I just showed you, and I was in the station in studio with the ABC7 anchors as we were watching this to talk about it afterwards. And while we're watching this press conference, both of them turn to me and they go, "There's no way this guy's letting them out." And I think they're absolutely right. I think what he was doing with this press conference was not giving us a press conference on the habeas. He was giving us a press conference on the motion to resentence and why he's probably going to oppose that. Because in his view, and I know people have strong feelings on this on both sides, but in this DA's view, these crimes were planned, they were premeditated, they sought alibis, they sought to destroy evidence, they sought to get other people to lie on their behalf. They lied about their own motives several times beforehand. I mean, he's, like I said, this was a closing argument for all the reasons why I just can't imagine all the reasons why he is going to oppose any kind of resentencing of these gentlemen. Can you imagine going from this press conference and then pulling a 180 at the resentencing hearing and saying, yeah, we think that they should be resentenced and given an opportunity to get parole? There's just no way. I know you guys have lots of questions, so let's go ahead and try to get to some of them now. But my whole point was, this to me was incredibly telling. He got asked a bunch of questions by reporters afterwards. What are you going to do at the resentencing? Because that's all anybody really cares about. This habeas thing was kind of tail wagging the dog. The clemency thing, everybody knows that's not going to happen. They want to know, what is your position? And he kept on saying, Ms. B, I'm going to get to your question right now, but let me just circle out this thought. He kept on saying, I'm going to handle that when we get to it. It's coming up on March 20th. But he kept on talking about it as if it were happening, which is interesting to me because it's a motion brought by the prosecution. If they wanted to, they could withdraw it tomorrow. But for some reason, he kept on talking about it happening. But I just think if the prosecutor's office rolls in with this same type of argument to a judge on March 20th, there's no way a judge is going to resentence Erik and Lyle. Ms. B says, if the Menendez brothers are successful in release, will this open the door for many more prisoners to go down the same road? 100,000% it will. Of course it will. And I think that's another thing that they're concerned about, is what kind of a precedent are we setting here by just saying that, listen, I mean, basically the arguments most in favor of the Menendez brothers are, it's been a long time. They've changed. They've rehabilitated. And we kind of look at these things a little bit differently culturally than we did 30 years ago. You don't think that qualifies for a bunch of people sitting in prison? Absolutely it does. Or certainly there's a bunch of people in prison who feel that it applies to them, and they would like the same opportunity that the Menendez brothers are trying to get. I listened to that guy and I thought, this is his closing argument. He's giving it ahead of time so that he gives everybody a soft landing when he goes into that hearing on March 20th and says, you know what? We've changed our view on this. We don't exactly see this the same way as my predecessor, George Gascon, did. Michelle says, just my humble opinion, not an excuse for murder in this scenario, but maybe they would have been given some hope for parole if this trial took place now. What do others think? That's a really good question, thought, comment, Michelle. That is kind of what a lot of people think, is that, listen, we have changed our view considerably, I think, about how we view people who are victims of this type of abuse, especially male victims. They were ridiculed at the time. They were, Saturday Night Live and late night television ridiculed them for ever even like making the claim that they were victims of abuse. I don't think you would see any of that today. I think that they would have been the trial would have been handled differently. Perhaps they would have been given more of an opportunity to talk about imperfect self-defense, which they really were trying to pursue. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the verdict would have come out different. End of the day, think about all those facts that he just talked about. 12 shotgun blasts, going back to reload, to come back to shoot your mother in the face to make sure that she's dead. The cover up, the premeditation, the changing of the stories, all of that would have come out today. I don't know, in spite of, alongside of all of the evidence of abuse, would that have changed everything? Rainy Day says, if one brother gets paroled, will the other automatically get paroled as well? I don't think there's any way that they're treated differently on this. I know that they're separate. They've had different prison experiences, but I don't think there's any way that one of them gets granted parole without the other. I think it's a package deal as much as it is they will be treated individually. I think it will be handled as a package deal. But stay tuned. March 20th. I think I have that date right. Do you think that they will get a chance for Governor Newsom will pardon them? Absolutely not. I don't think he wants to stick his neck out on this one. I think he's going to let, everybody else handle it and then just say, well, listen, I don't get involved in these types of things. I'm not going to really poke my nose in that. All right. Interesting stuff. Let's get to some of the trials that are coming up this week or ongoing. First of all, you've got Monica Sementilli out here in Los Angeles. That is still ongoing. That's a murder for hire case. She had her lover, who was her racquetball instructor. She apparently was in cahoots to him to murder her husband, Fabio Sementilli, who was a hairdresser. The guy was stabbed to death. The trial continues on that. And they're getting into aspects of how the money was making its way around, who was getting paid to help out in this. Jeffrey Ferguson, also here in the Southern California area. He's a judge. That gentleman right there was an Orange County judge for a very long time. And he got into an argument with his wife, Cheryl Ferguson, and he pointed finger guns at her. And then she said, allegedly, why don't you use a real gun? So he pulled a gun from his ankle holster and killed the woman dead. Yes, judges are packing, by the way. And he absolutely, it's a fascinating case because of who he is and how the case has been handled. And they're going to claim that it was an accident. So we'll see how that actually all turns out. That case is ongoing. Benjamin Elliott. Matt has become a new member on YouTube. Hello, my friend. We're going to be talking about you and talking about your book in just a minute here. So stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. Benjamin Elliott. This case was wild, out of Harris County, Texas. Him and his sister were both 17 years old. He stabs his sister in the neck, killing her, and then claims that he was essentially having a dream, essentially sleepwalking. Well, closing arguments today. It did not take the jury all that long to find him guilty. He will be sentenced tomorrow, and he's looking at 99 years in prison. And then finally, Robert Crimo out of the Chicago area in Illinois. This is the young man who killed several people. Really tragic story on Independence Day at a parade in Chicago. Jury selection has begun for that case. It's not going to be televised, but that's an ongoing case. Karen Reed will be in court on Tuesday. I know that a lot of people are following that one. A lot of fireworks took place on Friday. The judge sent out a notice to appear, and it says, quote, counsel should be prepared to address issues related to defendant's recent production pursuant to Rule 14, especially as the materials produced relate to prior representations made to the court on the record by defense counsel concerning the ARCO witnesses. We're going to see how that all turns out on Tuesday. That one could get incredibly interesting. Rex Heuermann will be also in court on Tuesday. The man's good for 7 murders that we know of, the Gilgo Beach murders. They're going to have a hearing on DNA and whether or not they're going to sever the trials. Donna Adelson will be in court on Wednesday, basically to have her jail isn't fun hearing. I want out of jail, Your Honor. Brian Walshe will be in court on Thursday. He murdered his wife, Anna Walshe, and they still haven't found her body. Courtney Clenney, also on Friday, related to search issues. She killed her boyfriend, Christian Obumseli. And then finally, Shanna Gardner will be in court on Friday. She was in cahoots with Mario Fernandez, who is about 4 inches shorter than her, to kill her husband, Jared Bredigan. All right, guys, some quick announcements before we shoot you on over This Wednesday, Joel Waldman will be on Wednesday Night Live from Surviving to the Survivor to talk about those updates on Donna Adelson. Thank you so much, Roro, for the super sticker. Saturday, we have a brand new date for our true crime weekly roundup. Thank you, Pammy, for that, for the love, and Jody Arrington for the love. We've just launched our True Crime Minute on the podcast, audio only, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Catch up for a True Crime Minute. And then this Sunday is a new Sunday Fun Day, meaning I expect to hear lots of new voice messages from everybody. We will be talking about that more. Leave us the messages so that we can have a real fun time on Sunday. We did it 2 weeks ago, and it was an absolute blast. You guys are fantastic. Put your hands down. Don't touch your keyboards. Don't go anywhere. We're going to shoot you right over to the live premiere with Matt Murphy.